evening. I am Cheryl Nunez, and I am Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at Olympic College. Thank you. And I just want to say how excited I am to welcome this beautiful audience to such an auspicious event for our community. So thank you for being here. This is our inaugural Presidential Equity and Excellence Lecture Series, just so you know. My role is a relatively new one for a vice president of the college. I have been tasked with helping to align our many assets in collaboration with our community in an effort to achieve our mission of excellence through equity. So you're going to hear us use that phrase often, excellence through equity. And it is founded on our principled belief that the vitality of this region and of the nation itself requires a zero-tolerance policy for any kind of disparity, gaps, or disadvantage rooted in a learner's socioeconomic background, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, or other social group memberships. Through this series, we seek to stimulate dialogue and thought throughout our region about what such a vision requires of all of us as individuals, as families, as communities, as organizations, working collectively. The college is fortunate to have in Dr. David Mitchell a president who is recognized as a strong advocate of educational equity throughout the state of Washington. And so, because this is his show, I'm going to cede the floor to him to introduce our distinguished speaker. Before I do, though, I would like to ask that you not use flash photography after the first couple of minutes of her talk. We want not to create any unnecessary distractions. So if you want to take photographs, please do so in the first minute or two. Thanks so much.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this auspicious occasion. I'd like to express special appreciation for Monica Sweet and her staff here at Bremerton High School for allowing us to use this beautiful facility. And I'd like to thank the many students, faculty, and staff and community members who have donated their time this evening to support this event. Let's give them all a round of applause. Next year, the college will have its own theater, and we'll be able to have events like this right on Olympic College campus, but we're very fortunate the high school let us be here this evening. I want to recognize two of the trustees, Darlene Peters and Harriet Bryant, that are here today. I hope I didn't leave any of my other bosses out. I don't know if they're here. I'm sorry. And I do want to thank Cheryl Nunez for her leadership in making this event a reality. Let's give Cheryl a round of applause. In our busy lives, it's easy to fall out of touch with the power of community. You are demonstrating it tonight across your rich diversities and perspectives by coming together to engage around a topic we can ill afford to ignore. Dr. Angela Davis, one of the most recognizable and acclaimed activists, authors, and intellectuals in the world, needs no introductions, so I will not belabor her biography, which you can read in the program. I mentioned to Dr. Davis earlier The last time I heard her speak was at UCLA. It was either 1968 or 1969, and my hair was much longer and it was brown. There could be no better way to kick off OC's Presidential Equity and Excellence Lecture Series than having Dr. Angela Davis be the inaugural speaker. An icon of Black Power movement and an outspoken advocate of prison abolition. She's had a celebrated career for over 50 years, and she has put academic theory into service in the ongoing struggles against race, class, and gender oppression. A distinguished professor emeriti at the University of California, Santa Cruz, she was a reminder to all of us that the life of the mind must ultimately concern itself with the life of people if education is to lead us towards a more just and sustainable future. Now please join me in welcoming to Bremerton Dr. Angela Davis.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the introduction.
You look good!
Let me see if I can get my notes together. First of all, I don't like to begin an event such as this without paying tribute to the indigenous people on whose land we gather this evening. And in this spirit, thinking about the larger context, I want to salute the Standing Rock Sioux for their courageous stand against the forces of genocide against Native people and against the environment. I thank Olympic College for inviting me to visit with you today. We had a relatively long journey from Seattle because we missed the ferry. But I'm so happy to be here, and I'd like to thank President Mitchell for the wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, Cheryl Nunez, who is responsible for my being here this evening. You know, oftentimes such terms as diversity, inclusion, equity are designed to deflect our attention away from the pressing issues of forging justice for communities that are persistently marginalized on the grounds of race and gender and sexuality and nationality and ability and other categories of social oppression. Especially given the demands, the exigent demands of the new era that will unfortunately be initiated by the inauguration next week of Donald Trump as President of the United States. Who would have ever believed that we would pronounce such words? The force and vigor of our anti-racist strategies and movements across the country may mean the difference between the consolidation of many forms of inequality and a tide of resistance, a constant tide of resistance that prevents the Trump administration from achieving its goal of making America great. Again, I actually didn't mean to say great. I think I meant to translate that phrase, which really means making America white again. Or perhaps that's not the accurate description. Perhaps a more accurate translation would be making America white supremacist again. And so in this context, we should be prepared to stand with communities of color, to stand together with immigrants, to stand together with Muslims and all who have become the targets of the upcoming administration. I understand that this talk inaugurates the Presidential Equity and Excellence Lecture Series. Equity and Excellence Lecture Series. It is a true honor to participate in this lecture series, especially since President David Mitchell understands the importance of anchoring the notion of equity in an analysis of and in resistance to racism and all of its interlocking oppressions. In other words, there can be no equity, there can be no inclusion without social justice, without justice. You know, it's interesting that we often tend to think about education and activism as distinct and separate. And sometimes we feel compelled to create a relationship between the two, between education and activism, as if we were speaking about two entirely separate spheres that have to be brought together if education is to have an impact on social change. But I want us to begin this evening with the assumption that significant social transformation is always grounded in education, is always grounded in education, and that the overarching purpose of knowledge is indeed to make a crucial difference in our social world. Now, I say this recognizing that education, as we know it, does not always enlighten. And education, as we know it, is designed to be accessible primarily to those who can afford it. And so to make such a claim would be in the very beginning to demand accessible education for all. And as far as we're concerned, what that means is free public education. Public education should be free. Now, I think we should also recognize that education happens in many venues. It doesn't necessarily have to be seen as confined to institutional structures where education is professionalized. You know, we learn in our communities. We learn on the job. You know, oftentimes people who have not had the opportunity to develop a formal education are more educated than those who have 5 degrees behind their names. The fact that activism is often considered to be something that happens outside of the venues where knowledge is produced is a consequence of what I would define as the ideological separation of processes that are organically related. It's amazing. Sometimes we have to struggle to understand the interrelationships and the connectedness of things that are clearly connected, but we think about them sometimes precisely as a result of the knowledge that we acquire as disconnected. And I can remember how long we struggle to be able to think racism and patriarchy together, because the assumption was that you could only think about racism as a discrete phenomenon. You couldn't think about it in its intersectional connections with a whole range of other modes of oppression. And as a matter of fact, I can remember, as an activist, people asking me, well, what are you anyway? Are you black or are you a woman? As if it's possible to make such a distinction. And I say this because, analytically, we oftentimes do make such distinctions. And sometimes we're compelled to separate things for purposes of analysis. But then we believe that a process that is actually about attempting to understand something and therefore analytically separating it, we believe that the things are actually separated in reality. So, that's what some forms of education can get you. But in any event, I want us to think about education and activism as processes that are organically related. Education should spur people toward activism. Education is indeed an indispensable form of activism. Given that this is the month during which we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy, it is important to recognize that the pivotal event that catapulted Dr. King to national and international recognition, the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, was precisely enabled by the work of college professors and their students. Joanne Robinson, who wrote a book which I love, which is called The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Started It. She, along with her students, mimeographed. Do you know what that means? I mean, in the era of social media, yeah, I see someone in the audience doing this. This is how we used to get the word out. But after Rosa Parks was arrested, they stayed up all night long mimeographing the leaflets that were passed out to people asking them not to ride the bus, and thus the success of the Montgomery bus boycott. And I can't fail, even though I have mentioned this time and time again, I think it bears mentioning again this evening, that the people who refused to ride the bus were black women, and they were domestic workers, they were maids, they were cooks, they were washerwomen. And these are the people whose collective imagination allowed for the emergence of the boycott and thus also the civil rights movement, leading us to this moment of conversations about the work that still remains to be done in order to eradicate racism. I think that there are oftentimes historical actors whom we fail to recognize because we are so accustomed to the theory that social change is brought about by powerful individuals, usually charismatic men. And so, therefore, when we celebrate the legacy of Dr. King, it is essential to think about, all of the people, and especially all of the women who made it possible for a civil rights movement to emerge. Education drives us to ask questions precisely about those things we most take for granted. And equity in education should reflect and should promote challenges to injustice wherever they occur. I want to quote a scholar whose field is education by the name of Henry Giroux. He teaches at Macalester University in Canada. And one of his articles in which he writes about Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, he writes, and this is a relatively long passage, and I'll read it slowly. As the market-driven logic of neoliberal capitalism continues to devalue all aspects of the public good, one consequence has been that the educational concern with excellence has been removed from matters of equity. While the notion of schooling as a public good has largely been reduced to a private good. Both public and higher education are largely defined through the corporate demand that they provide skills, knowledge, and credentials that will provide the workforce necessary for the United States to compete and maintain its role as the major global economic and military power. Consequently, there is little interest in both public and higher education, and most importantly, in many schools of education, for understanding pedagogy as a deeply civic, political, and moral practice. That is pedagogy as a practice for freedom. Pedagogy as a practice of freedom. If it is true that pedagogy can be seen as a practice of freedom, and it is also true, as Toni Morrison once remarked, that the function of freedom is to free someone else, that is to say, freedom can never be understood as a quality of the individual. It is always deeply collective. Then we can ask the question, how can our work in the classroom impel those we teach to extend the practice of freedom to other realms? If we think of the classroom as another feminist scholar by the name of Chandra Mohanty once pointed out, the classroom as a site for the practice of democracy, as a rehearsal for citizenship, not the citizenship that requires papers, and excludes more people than it includes, but rather a notion of citizenship that extends to the entire planet, global citizenship, then I think that students will be able to imagine themselves as agents of progressive and radical transformation in the world. You all know that Fidel Castro recently died. And so I actually decided to go back and look at some of his speeches and work, because for me it marked the end of an era. And so I came upon a speech that Fidel Castro made in 1961, and it was shortly after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. And he said, prior to the revolution, the worker was told to believe, to believe. He had no access to books. The revolution tells the people to read, because this is the road of the truth. This is certainly a time, I believe, given the result of the recent election. This is a time to resist what you might call the instrumentalization of education. The assumption that the only or the primary value of education is the role that it plays in the acquisition of a job, or the fact that education can make the difference between a low-wage job and a higher-paying job. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't underestimate how important it is to get a good job. One of the reasons so many people are behind bars today is precisely because of the paucity of jobs. And there's certainly this problem is certainly not going to be solved by Donald Trump making deals. So jobs are important, but education is about a lot more. Education is about the cultivation of the humanity in all of us. It assists us to understand that freedom is a process toward which all humanity should be striving. There can be no liberation without education. An education that fails to steer us in the direction of liberation is not truly education. It may be training, it may be knowledge subordinated to profit, but it is not truly education. Education, it seems to me, is about the collective cultivation of the mind, the spirit, and the body. Historically, you might argue that Black people in this country valued education more than anything else, precisely because they understood its connection with freedom. And on this very long journey from Seattle to Bremerton, I had the opportunity to speak with two very fascinating young people, Darrell Green and Tajda Green. I don't know, are you over there? Okay. So we had a conversation, a wide-ranging conversation during the time it took to drive from downtown Seattle to Bremerton. And I was telling them about the night schools during slavery. We were actually talking about Black women's role, and Darrell was wondering, why Black women tend to move toward leadership much more quickly than men. And I said, well, there may be something historical about this, because black women have, even though we have not been able to acknowledge the work that black women have done, because their historical role has been entirely overshadowed and rendered invisible. But in virtually every movement that has anything to do with black freedom, you will discover that black women played pivotal roles. And so I was talking to them about the night schools that happened during slavery. The fact that many women ran what were called night schools. That is to say, after midnight, when the slaveholders had all gone to bed, people would gather and learn. And those who had skills, the women who had skills, would teach others how to read and write, which was really extraordinary, considering that in some states they did that under pain of death, because it was not only illegal to teach a slave how to read and write, but in some states it carried the death penalty. Moreover, when you consider that they had been working all day long, so it's like, work from can't see in the morning to can't see no more at night, and then teach after midnight. I mean, that's really extraordinary. But I grew up in a family of educators. Both my father and my mother were teachers. And from the time I was very young, they insisted. As a matter of fact, my siblings and I all learned how to read and write by the time we were 3, because they understood that without education, there would be no future. Without education, there would be no future. No liberation without education. Frederick Douglass wrote about stealing an education. As a slave, of course, he had no access to schooling, although at one point the wife of his master, who was from the North and not really schooled in the matters of slavery, began to teach him how to read and write until her husband prohibited her. And then what he did was to ask the master's child, because the wife had been teaching him along with her young son. The son continued to get the education, and Frederick Douglass cajoled him to ask him to see his speller, to ask him how to write this word. So he talks about stealing his education. He pilfered an education because he knew that there is no liberation without education. And if one considers the period after the abolition of slavery, one of the major struggles undertaken at that time was the struggle for education, for public education, for the right to education. And of course, there were many things that former slaves struggled for and did not achieve. But they did attain education, even though it turned out, after the brief period of radical Reconstruction, that it was a segregated education. As a matter of fact, I attended those segregated schools in Birmingham, Alabama. Nevertheless, it was education. But the point that I'm making is that when former slaves fought for the right to education and called for public education in the South, and eventually won the right to public education for themselves, they also won the right to public education for poor white children who had not had access to education before. And I mention this because there is the tendency to assume that whenever one talks about black issues or black lives, that one is talking about something that is very narrow. And therefore there have been those who have suggested that we not say Black Lives Matter, but rather that we say all lives matter. But the point is, all lives can matter, and Black lives and Native American lives and Latino lives don't matter. All men are created equal, right? But on the other hand, if Black lives matter, that truly means that all lives matter. And the education we require and should desire is precisely an education that allows us to make such connections. What is education? I would define education as the capacity to raise questions about the world. And as I previously said, to raise questions especially about those things we most take for granted. As a matter of fact, you can imagine that during the era of slavery, most people assumed that slavery would be eternal. They could not imagine life without slaves. But as a matter of fact, Orlando Patterson, the sociologist of history, who in his amazing book, which is called Slavery and Social Death, he argues that the very notion of freedom with which we work in the Western society, in the global North, must have been the idea of a slave. It must have been about a yearning to become free while experiencing conditions of unfreedom. And I mean, this is why the Black presence in this part of the world is important, because it represents a constant, ongoing struggle for freedom. And in that sense, that struggle for freedom belongs to everyone. And so therefore, when we talk about Black History Month, which we're going to be celebrating in February, that's not just for Black people. You know? It's about celebrating the fact that Black people have never given up. We are still struggling for freedom. And that struggle has involved people from many other communities as well. As a matter of fact, you cannot tell the history of people of African descent in the Americas without also telling the history of the indigenous people. And there are many other connections. But education is the capacity to raise these kinds of questions about the world. It is about our ability to imagine ourselves as a part of something much larger than we are as individuals. And unfortunately, neoliberal ideology, global capitalism, these forces try to convince us that we are really only puny individuals fighting against each other. And some, like Donald Trump, emerge, with all of the capital, with all of the money. But isn't it so much better to think of ourselves as connected and related and involved in a quest for freedom that goes back so many centuries, and that is going to continue in the future. And so education, my mother used to say when I was young, to persuade me that education was important. She used to say, well, it will broaden your horizon. And she would also say that, and travel will broaden your horizon as well. And, my mother was a teacher. And my mother was actually a foster child who grew up in a rural area of Alabama. And her foster parents did not believe that education was that important. So when she finished elementary school, they thought she should get a job and help to support the family. And fortunately, she had teachers who were impressed by her intelligence. And after she graduated from elementary school, she ran away from home. She moved from a little town called Sylacauga, Alabama, to Birmingham, the big city, found work as a domestic and made enough money to pay for a room at the YWCA so that she could go to high school. And fortunately, the principal noticed her, and eventually the principal and his wife invited her to live with them, and they supported her. So she ended up going to college and getting a graduate degree, which, no one would have ever thought. Yeah, the importance of education. I've talked about raising questions about those things that we often consider unquestionable. For many years, I've been doing work around the institution of the prison. And I asked myself, how did I end up doing this? Now, how did I end up devoting almost my entire life to doing, work for the freedom of political prisoners, against the prison industrial complex? I did. At one point in my life, I was charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. And I was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. At a time when J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI, and Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, and Richard Nixon was the president of the United States. So, many people, even though they knew that I was innocent, did not think that I would ever make it out of that predicament. After all, we were talking about the 3 most powerful men in the world. But here I am. And I am here precisely because people all over the country and literally all over the world came together and refused to believe that it was impossible to confront the 3 most powerful men in the world. And as a matter of fact, we won. We won. But during the time I was in jail, I had just concluded my first year teaching at UCLA. And then my second and third year I spent in jail. And although I had been doing work to free political prisoners, I learned so much, even though I was in solitary confinement, most of the time. That was such an enlightening period that now when I look back on it, as frightening as it was, especially contemplating the prospect of being put to death, but today I'm really thankful for that experience because it helped to shape my entire life. And it taught me the value of people coming together, the value of community. And whenever people speak about me as an individual, and the older I get, the more reverent people become, which, and that's good and that's bad. I always like to point out that it's really not about me. I kind of stand here as evidence of the power of community. And so I always try to make people understand how, under these conditions of capitalism, we always need to find the individual. We always need to point to the individual. We don't know how to conceptualize collectivities and communities. We forget how much we ourselves are created in and through and by community. And so I learned during the time I was in jail important lessons about community. I was in a women's jail because that's how jails and prisons are structured. They're for men, and most of them are for men, and then there's some for women, right? Is that problematic? Is there something wrong with that? This is what I mean about learning how to raise questions about things that appear totally normal. And therefore, when we say that there's something wrong about the way the prison system is structured, the gender structure of the prison system, it allows us to think about the role that prisons play in perpetuating the ideologies of gender with which we work every day. And so therefore, the attention that we focus on prisons should not only be about those who are inside, And of course, it should be about those who are inside. But it can't be about those who are inside in the way that many people like to think about doing prison work as missionary work. You know, it can't be about the poor people who, are locked away. It has to be recognizing that the people who are inside are human beings. And we have to figure out how to enter into egalitarian relationships with them, even as we do that work. And it has to acknowledge that there's something wrong about the gender structure of the prison precisely because it completely excludes those who do not fit so easily into our normalized categories of gender. You know, what about trans people? You know, what about people who are gender non-conforming? So these, a lot of questions can be raised simply by looking at this institution of the prison. And I'm using this as an example of what the kind of education I'm proposing to you today, critical thinking, can urge us to the kind of education that can urge us to destabilize those things we take for granted. To me, education is about making people feel uncomfortable. It's about talking about those things that are always supposed to be hidden behind a veil of silence. It is about recognizing the ways in which those silences shape us and the way we think about the world and our relations with other people. And I mention this because you probably know that over the last few years, people have begun to question mass incarceration. A lot of people are talking about it, right? President Obama was the first sitting president to visit a prison last summer before this last summer. Even the conservative Republicans are talking about how important it is to downsize the prison population because too many government funds are being devoured by what is the most massive prison system in the entire world. And so I guess they want more, more electronic bracelets, and they want to extend, normally we think about prisons as kind of containing carcerality, because that's, locking people up, carceral strategies. But they want to extend carcerality to the entire community. So people are going to be walking around with their ankle bracelets on, under surveillance, and so, well, anyway. I think that what I want to suggest is that the kind of education that I'm referring to will always push us to go more and more deeply. We never stop. We constantly question. And it's not just a question of the fact that there are, 2.5 million people in U.S. prisons, which is 25% of the world's imprisoned population, which is And the U.S. is 5% of the global population, right? And if you look at women, the U.S. has 32%, 33% of the global female prison population. So 1/3 of all of the women who are in prison in the world are in prison in the U.S. We live in a prison nation. And we should call it what it is. It is a prison nation. But the point is, the problems aren't going to be solved simply by letting a few people out of prison here and there. Decarceration is important, and that is a concept that should be even more important to us now than incarceration. But what about abolition? Why cannot we abolish these institutions that have accomplished nothing? That have accomplished nothing. And this does not mean that we are not sensitive to the harm and the pain that people inflict on each other. But the point is, prisons don't stop any of that violence from happening. As a matter of fact, prisons tend to reproduce the violence. And I want us to figure out, how we can begin to minimize violence in our worlds. I want to figure out, how to get rid of gender violence. And carceral feminism has not solved that problem. You know what carceral feminism is, right? No. Okay. There are a lot of different kinds of feminisms. So, we shouldn't assume that there's only one form of feminism. But carceral feminisms are feminisms that rely on the notion that one can solve problems by using the prison system. Therefore, if we consider the most pervasive form of violence in the world, gender violence, the assumption that we can solve the problem of gender violence simply by sending the perpetrators to prison. And the thing is that over the last 30, 40 years, since this issue has emerged into the public light, many more perpetrators of gender violence have gone to prison. Not only in this country, but all over the world. But it's also the case that the incidence of gender violence has not declined at all. People still go to prison, and then who are the ones who end up going to prison anyway? It's the men of color who have or have not committed acts of gender violence. And prisons are strange institutions, because once people get sent into these institutions, then we forget about them. But that also means we forget about the reason they were sent there. So we think that we've done our duty, but as a matter of fact, we're participating in the replication and reproduction of the problem of violence. And so I really want to get rid of violence, especially gender violence. I want to figure out what we can do to eventually rid our worlds. Now, this may not happen tomorrow. It may take, there are those who believe that it will take generations, many generations. But that doesn't mean that we don't start doing that work now. That we don't start doing the hard work of figuring out what we have to do in order to guarantee that this violence is reduced. I mean, we know that it has to do with, there's cycles of violence. It often has to do with families. Unfortunately, families are often the most violent institutions. And we don't, and we continue to act as if, families were refuges, and that they're these, places of love. Some families are places of love. But we don't, most of the time when we talk about gender violence, we imagine a stranger. It's like a stranger danger. But then we don't talk about the hard things. We don't talk about incestuous violence. We don't talk about intimate violence. We don't understand the relationship between violence that happens within intimate spaces and violence that happens in institutional spaces. Structural violence, state violence. We haven't had these conversations. And therefore the violence continues. And it seems to me that the violence that happens in intimate spaces also helps to reproduce the violence that happens in institutional spaces. So the intimate reproduces the institutional reproduces the intimate. And until we can begin to deal with these connections, we will simply say, this person has committed this horrendous act, send them to prison. And it will happen over and over and over and over again. And this is why prison abolition is so important. It's not only the fact that people behind bars are living these dehumanized lives, which they are, but it's also the impact that these institutions have on all of our relations with one another. This is why it is so important not to simply say, we know about how horrible prisons are. We know that we have to get rid of mass incarceration. Yes. We should know that, but it's also much deeper than that. And this is why feminism is important. Yeah, I was talking, what kind of feminism was I talking about before? What did I call it? Carceral feminism, right. But there's also what I would call abolition feminism. And I do believe that if Hillary Clinton had studied abolition feminism, she might have been much more successful in the last election. Well, I don't know, I think we probably needed an entirely different candidate. From an entirely different party. But, I cringed every time I heard her talk about the glass ceiling. Because, how many women are already at the top who can penetrate the glass ceiling? She was talking about an elitist feminism, one that doesn't take into consideration the predicament of the vast majority of women. And, when you ask, why is it that 53% of white women voted for Hillary Clinton? Voted against Hillary Clinton, for Donald Trump, 53%, right? 51? Okay, thank you for the correction. 51%. But that's still the majority of white women. And something is wrong with that. Now, how many black women voted against Donald Trump or voted for Hillary Clinton? 95? Okay, I had 94, but maybe I seem to be 1 point off. And the thing is that many of those black women did not necessarily think that Hillary Clinton was, I guess I consider myself one of them. I voted for Hillary Clinton. Only the third time I've ever voted for a candidate from a major party in my entire life. I voted for Barack Obama twice. And I voted for Hillary Clinton. But, and some people have asked me about a statement I made. As a matter of fact, Beverly Bond, who does Black Girls Rock, I don't know if you've ever seen Black Girls Rock on BET. So she interviewed me the other day for a book she's doing of some of the women who've gone through that program. And so she was saying, you made a statement, and she quoted me, "I am not so narcissistic as to say that I will not vote for Hillary Clinton." And she said, I said, oh, I can't believe the life that. First of all, it was totally taken out of context. I was talking about the importance of building a new political party, a more radical political party that speaks to the needs of people of color and immigrants, and a party that is feminist. And I went on and on and on. And then I said, well, if we want to build this kind of party, then which candidate do we vote for now? Which candidate will allow us the space to continue radical organizing? And then I went on to say that there are a lot of people who think that their radical politics are so pure that they can't bring themselves to do something that is so profane. And then I said, I am not so narcissistic, that was the context, as to say that I refuse to vote. I mean, that was the whole context. Yeah, I think I better wind up because I've gone over my time. And I'm just looking at my notes to see whether there's anything else that is really important that I wanted to say. This is going to be a hard period. But I was thinking on that night when we all learned that, when we couldn't believe, when we were in utter disbelief about what we were hearing from the news people. It was a very sad night, wasn't it? But then, I've been around for quite a while, and I could not remember a similar reaction to an election. I remember when Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, and people didn't cry. Although sometimes I think we should release our emotions. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with crying. But we went out in the streets. And we said, that we resist. As a matter of fact, during the Nixon administration, I think we had the largest anti-war demonstration that ever took place in this country. The demonstration against the war in Vietnam. Over 1 million people, which was a huge number in those days. We did not have Facebook. We did not have social media. And so I think that we should, we've mourned, and that's okay, but as Joe Hill said, don't mourn, organize. And I think that this is what we have to do. This can be a very exciting period ahead. And remember, now, my statistical help in the corner over there said, I understand that Donald Trump got something like 25.6% of the people who voted. Is that right? And Hillary got 25.5. And we all know that she got 3 million more popular votes. And so we can't treat this as the triumph of conservatism, the unquestioned triumph of white supremacy. Most of the people who did not vote would have voted against Donald Trump had they voted. So we should be aware of our constituencies. Our constituencies are far greater than the white supremacist constituencies represented by Donald Trump and his, don't let me talk about his cabinet and Jeff Sessions. But anyway, let us get ready for the coming months by building and rebuilding and consolidating community, by recognizing that we will have to struggle over the coming period as we have never struggled before. This is the way we will get through the next 4 years. Freedom, after all, is a constant struggle. Thank you very much.
Wait, there's more. Please join us out in the Commons area for a reception. The OC bookstore is selling books, including Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and it's a time for us to really enjoy the community that's here tonight. Thank you so much.